Well, I'm Jannette Berkley Patton. I'm a professor at UMKC, and I'm going to talk a little bit about our Faithful Response to COVID-19 project that was funded through NIH, and its aim is to increase COVID-19 testing in African American churches. If I have time, I don't know, we'll see. I'll talk a little bit about how we've applied some of our church-based work, not just around COVID-19, but around HIV as well, and dementia and some other things, to a broader study that included other community sectors besides churches. So just as a quick overview, I'm going to talk a lot about the whole foundation of our work is grounded in community-based participatory research. I'm not sure if you've heard that term before, but I'll tell you what it is. Again, I'll talk about our Faithful Response to COVID-19 projects and how we've applied that to address COVID-19 across the broader Jackson County area. And then I'll talk a little bit about what we're learning and some of the implications for community engaged research. So I always kind of like to tell people, you know, this is who I am. And if we start from the bottom and work our way up, I was born and raised in Kansas City, Missouri, in the urban Kansas City area around 39th and Prospect. So if you guys are familiar with that area, I went to Passaic High School and pretty much was raised in the Black church. So when I shifted from my career, my undergraduate degree is from KU in electrical engineering. I was in defense, aerospace defense, cables for nuclear weapons and the whole shebang. So when I got out of the war machine, material from fighter jets, all of that, seen it all, done it all. When I got out of that career, moved to behavioral psychology at KU. I was really interested in what was it about human behavior, particularly the behavior of those in my community, in the African American community, that made some people succeed and others who had all of the resources available to them not. And so that's what's pretty much driven my career. I'm the director of the Community Health Research Group at UMKC, and I direct our Health Equity Institute. Okay, I think everybody in this room is kind of. That's my house where I grew up on 40th and South Benton, right around the corner from 39th. That's correct.
That's on 48th?
No, this is 40th to South Benton, 4024 South. Keep watching the house to see if it's going to go on sale. Maybe one day I'll. But I direct our Community Health Research Group, like I mentioned, at KU. And we have worked on a number of health disparity issues that affect the African American community, from HIV and STDs. We have continued work for the past 13 years on diabetes and heart disease, and have a full clinical trial running right now with pre-diabetic African Americans and a tailored diabetes prevention program. We've done pilot studies around mental health screening in churches, dementia screening with the KU Alzheimer's Disease Center in churches, and then most recently this work that we're doing around COVID-19 testing with African American churches, as well as some work that we're doing that's funded through Jackson County around COVID-19 vaccination. I always kind of like to start with this slide. There's a lot going on, but basically this is the slide that kind of grounds the fact that while African Americans compared to other ethnic minorities, the fact that, you know, we are burdened with most of the health conditions. And you go down this list and you look at everything from environmental conditions like unhealthy housing to chronic diseases like cardiovascular diseases, hypertension, diabetes, obesity, HIV. Used to be that suicides wasn't even on the list, and now should probably put a little light X right there because of the growing rates of suicides among African Americans. But all that to say, particularly with the impact of chronic diseases in the African American population, we weren't surprised when COVID-19 hit, that the African American community was going to be hard hit. All the indications were there if you look at the past and the existing health conditions that have burdened African communities. And then, as most of you may know, certainly African Americans had 2 times the rate of new cases of COVID-19, were twice as likely to die from COVID-19, 3 times as likely to be hospitalized due to COVID-19 nationally and in Kansas City. And so when it happened again, we were not, surprised. But all that to say, in doing this work in addressing health disparities with African-American communities, we've really drank the Kool-Aid on community-based participatory research. And this is an approach of research that equitably involves all of the community partners. Everybody has a say at the table, because we understand that even though we may be researchers, and even though even me, who grew up in Kansas City and in the church environment, you know, as a community member, I still am not the expert on African-American churches. And so we really want to tap into the unique strengths and the expertise and the experiential knowledge that our community partners have to better the science, to better the research. And so in using a CBPR approach, this is really important because we really believe that the research topic should be of the most importance to the community, not the researcher. Because we know how research usually takes place, right? Usually we gather in rooms around tables as scientists, we get on the whiteboard, we formulate our projects, we don't invite community members into those meetings, we launch these great studies, we find these incredible outcomes, and then what usually happens? We're out, right? We helicopter in and we helicopter out, and even though there may have been some beneficial outcomes for the community, we move on to what? The next study, right? And if we're disseminating what we learned from that study, it's usually happening with who? Other folks like us, other scientists at scientific conferences and publications. And so in that type of process, the community really has not been involved. And we believe that not only should we not be the ones sitting in the conference rooms developing what we should work on, but the community really should have an input on what's important to them, and then combining that knowledge with action so that we can bring about social change. I mean, ultimately, we really want to have population health impact in doing our community engaged work. So in using this process, we've worked very heavily with our community action boards. The KC Faith Initiative is a community action board that we've had now formally running for 13 years, informally for about 15 years. Quarterly we meet. 30 people show up or more each time. I still get tingles when I walk in the room because I'm like, they keep coming back. Like, so we must be doing something right. But we usually really use that time to get their input on the next projects that we should be working on. We have time within those meetings where they help us design interventions. In our last CAB meetings, we brought up weight loss drugs and continuous glucose monitors, and had an expert there as well. And if I could have recorded that conversation, I mean, it really gives you insight as to, you can't just develop this stuff in a vacuum. You really need to have that input to hear the concerns, what they see as the barriers, the challenges, and then what they also see as some of the facilitators. And then when COVID hit, one of our leading faith leaders in Kansas City, Reverend Eric Williams, who's actually going to be on the panel this afternoon. And if you have a chance to hear him, I highly recommend it. He's fantastic and he's funny, especially for somebody right after lunch. He developed the Clergy Response Network in response to COVID-19 because what we had seen was that nothing was happening in the Black community, even though the numbers were coming up disproportionately impacting African Americans. But in using this approach with our CABs, we engage them in every single phase of the research study. So that's including as agenda setters, as intervention designers, as intervention developers, helping us to evaluate. We teach them how to evaluate what they're doing to provide information on how they're implementing the project. They help us to disseminate what we're learning. I mean, they go to conferences with us. They've been on national webinars with us. They're on the publications. And we know that when we use this approach, we have better impact, and not only that, sustainability. Because for all of those different projects that I talked about, we've been able to sustain in some kind of manner. It may not look like the millions of dollars that you get from NIH. It may not look like that Cadillac. It still looks like the Pinto that can go, you know, the distance. And so we really believe in trying to figure out how to do this with our community partners, not only to have impact, but sustainability. We've been doing this work with African-American churches for almost 2 decades now for many, many reasons, because African-American churches have so many strengths, including the fact that they have diverse membership. I mean, where else can you go in the African-American community and have the babies of the church and the elders in the church? You have the poorest of the poor and the richest of the rich all sitting in the same pews. They tend to have very similar doctrinal beliefs and activities. Usually I can go into any Black Christian church, whether it's here, whether it's in the South, whether it's on the West Coast, know the songs, know when to sit, stand, and say amen, you know what I mean? And they tend to have quite a bit of influence in social support, particularly the pastor. We like to say that if the pastor says it, it is done. I mean, we have seen this in action because we do observations of our studies sitting in the pews, and the pastors can say, get up and go do this, and people get up and do it. And if that he or she, if that pastor is a Pied Piper, even more so the case. And then churches also have pretty much are committed to doing outreach ministries that serve their community members. So that's like the food programs, the social services programs, the after school programs, all of these programs that really go beyond the pews and into the communities that they're located in. And probably what's most important is that most African Americans attend church. About 50% of African Americans attend church weekly. And we have found that even since the pandemic, when church attendance has lagged, in many cases, we're still finding that 50% of the folks at our churches are there weekly. So a very strong attendance, which gives many opportunities to expose them to the interventions that we design. And again, for scalability and sustainability, because, and I'll show this later, we're at the top of the Bible Belt. So churches are prevalent all throughout this area. And if we can design interventions that can be easily adapted to different churches, we really can tap into that scalability and have population health impact. So what I wanted to do is to go back about 15 years to tell you how we started this work, how we got to COVID-19. One of the first things that I did with the K01 grant that I have from NIH was to really try to understand what is it about the church capacity, the church communication structure that can lend itself for health promotion interventions. And so we assessed church capacity with 56 churches in the Kansas City, Missouri area. And of course, we found that most had Sunday services and midweek services. But we also noted the fact that at that time, about 40% of them had digital projectors. Now it's about 60 to 70%. So they can, project their messages, put QR codes up on screens. I mean, churches are high tech, institutions now. But then also that they had all of these outreach ministries, because at the time when we started doing our research, the church-based studies only focus on the church members. And we tried to say, why not really tap into that strength that says churches can have reach beyond the church and into those communities that they serve through these outreach ministries. So that's part of the model of the church-based work that we do, is to include community members who are using outreach services in our studies. And so at that time, we're talking about 20 years ago, HIV was that was a thing that was really becoming prevalent, more so prevalent in our African-American communities here in Kansas City. And the Black Church Week of Prayer, which is now the National Week of Prayer for the Healing of AIDS, has started in Kansas City in 1995. So a very long-running initiative, one of the first actually in the country, believe it or not, outside of the Black Church Week of Prayer in Harlem. Kansas City has been one of the longest running initiatives of this type. But what happens during the Week of Prayer is that a lot of activities take place. So you got pastors preaching about HIV and getting testing for HIV. You've got parades going on. You've got pastors from Kansas City, Missouri playing basketball against pastors from Kansas City, Kansas, to really kind of bring the message home during the game and get people tested. All of these things are taking place. So thousands of people are coming out and a few people are getting tested, right? But then what do you think was happening the other 51 weeks of the year? Absolutely nothing. And the pastor said, we really need to figure out how can we continue to focus on HIV beyond the Week of Prayer and even more so get people tested. I have to say too, again, why you want to listen to your community, because as you know, one of the primary prevention strategies for HIV, at least what it used to be, was what? Condom use, right? Protection, And so we had a meeting with pastors and they were like, it was a brawl and it was in a church and we thought we were gonna have to call security because some were really for condoms in churches and some thought that was just a really immoral approach to take. And what they landed on, because they felt like it was a social justice issue, was we can do HIV testing. And they felt like that was a social justice issue because they felt like that was a public health issue, was an issue where African Americans in Kansas City didn't really know about a lot about HIV. And the churches could be a setting to really encourage or promote that and normalize testing. So they said yes to HIV testing and education, and no to, oh, that's fine, that should be to condom use. And that's how Taking It to the Pews was born. I'm just going to quickly go through this again, just to kind of show you how we have been doing this work around HIV and then adapted it for other health issues so that when COVID hit, we could hit the ground running to address it. We built with our faith leaders culturally tailored, religiously tailored toolkits. We like to say that in our toolkits, there's a tool for everything that happens in church, from responsive reading, sermon guides, testimonials, church fans. If it happens in church, we pretty much have a tool for it. And then here's some of the outcomes from our TIPS study. It was with 14 churches. We had actually 1,543 participants, a little over 1,400 of them were African Americans. These are the self-reported data, which were not significant. So that you can see that for our intervention churches, we increased HIV testing from 37% to 41%, and our comparison churches from 34% to 38%. But when we looked at our testing numbers, because we made testing available to anyone, you did not have to participate in our study to get tested. You can see that our intervention church outperformed our comparison churches by more than twice as many tests being conducted, and that was significant. And so we learned some things because in this case, our pastors told us you cannot link people's HIV test results and whether or not they got tested to their survey data. They were very people are scared enough about HIV. The stigmatization of HIV, I mean, it's still a case, but it was even more so then. And so they were very clear about that. So we couldn't link the self-reported data to the objective data because we believe this data is really misrepresentative. Because a lot of people think they're going to get an HIV test when they go in the doctor's office and they do their annual blood test. They think they're automatically getting an HIV test, and that's not the case. And we think that's inflating some of that data. But anyway, we did 3 phases of TIPS across my KO1, another pilot study to the clinical trial, the data that I just showed, with over 4,000 people exposed to that intervention. So again, when COVID-19 came along, were we not surprised? Because we know the same social determinants, the same issues to access to care, the same issues even around stigma were in play with COVID when the pandemic hit. And so the National Institutes of Health came up with this RADx Up initiative. Have any of you heard of the RADx Up initiative? The Rapid Acceleration of Diagnostics with Underserved Populations. And because of the work that we have been doing with churches, we were able to quickly respond to a first call for grants for applications with the RADx Up initiative. And the aim of our study was to develop and test a religiously tailored COVID-19 testing intervention with African American churches. We also wanted to understand what were some of the modifiable barriers in regards to COVID-19 testing. And then lastly, look at some of those relationships between exposure to our intervention components and whether or not people got tested. And just to kind of give you an overview of the RADx Up initiative, it's pretty large. I think now they've funded, 140 something projects across the country. This map is probably outdated and this was created about 9 months ago or so. But there we are right there in the middle of the country, and KU also, I believe, had 2 of these RADx Up awards as well. And as you may know, we're also at the top of the Bible Belt. And so in having that position and knowing that there are so many churches, particularly African-American churches in Kansas City, Missouri, and Kansas, as a matter of fact, you really can't drive more than about 5 blocks without running into a church. Try it sometimes just as an exercise. So again, that potential for scalability and dissemination. I'm sorry. My phone.
Yeah.
Turn it off. Give me 1 second, guys. Sorry about that. Um, and then we just wanted to show too, to just kind of bring home this understanding of the number of churches, particularly in socially vulnerable areas of Kansas City. I mean, here we are at the UMKC School of Medicine. The churches that are in squares are churches that we've worked with across the last 20 years. You can see that overall, there are probably about 20 churches or so here within just a mile or two radius of our School of Medicine. And this doesn't even include those little churches that don't even show up on the map or not registered, you know what I mean, online somewhere. And so the work that we've done has been primarily, particularly for this study, in the Kansas City urban core around some of the most socially vulnerable zip codes. So 64130, 64128, 2927, in trying to address COVID-19, because this is where we saw some of the highest rates of COVID-19 in Kansas City during the height of the pandemic. Do you have a question? Oh. And as I mentioned earlier, that the Clergy Response Network was developed by Reverend Eric Williams. I'm again speaking this afternoon on a panel, because he really saw the need that was happening. So when people started getting sick and dying and they didn't know what was happening, and this was before March of 2020, people really started getting sick and dying like in 2019. Who do you think were those first responders that people's family were calling to say, come pray for this person? And it's pastors, right? So they were seeing what was happening even before it was showing up on the radar screen. And then when it really became full blown, where were people going when they needed food and toiletries and they were going to the church? So, and having questions about what does this mean? Because what we learned, as most of you probably would guess, people didn't really trust what they were hearing from the government. As a matter of fact, they were using, Dr. Google and Dr. Mayo Clinic, you know what I mean, online sources, and then listening to what other people were telling them about COVID-19. And we began meeting with the Clergy Response Network when they first formed, which was in June of 2020. So pretty quickly after the pandemic really, became recognized in March of 2020. And then they helped us set the research agenda. And here's what's interesting, because we had this relationship with these faith leaders for so many years, they called us into those meetings and said, we need to be able to create brochures and put messages on our websites and develop text messages so we can pump out information to our membership and our call lines. And we really need your help in doing that. But in the meantime, they were once again serving as those first responders, just as they've done historically during COVID-19. So they were really leading in providing, PPP, expanded food programs, grief counseling. They were some of the first sites for COVID-19 testing and then eventually vaccinations in inner city Kansas City. Because if you recall, some of the early sites were happening like at Lee Summit, at the John Knox big pavilion center, and these places where people who lived in the city just couldn't get to. Same with the vaccinations when they first came out. They were happening in locations outside of the city, even though it was folks living in the city that were really hard hit by COVID-19. So use the same process that I mentioned before to address COVID-19. And in this case, particularly with our Clergy Response Network. And they helped us to develop a whole toolkit of materials that they could print or that they could use electronically, because as you recall, they couldn't meet in person. There were limits on how many people could meet in person. And so they again they developed and we did the editing around sermon guides and responsive readings and testimonials. We built a whole text messaging platform that has over 300 text messages that again were culturally and religiously tailored. So things like, God knows your heart. Do you know your status? Get tested for COVID-19 and stay safe. Along with links within these text messages that they could get more information, more resources, and then keywords or smart words that could connect them to how to reduce their stress, how to engage in physical activity at home, how to continue to try to eat better, because people were isolated. And we really wanted to get that information out as well. And then we trained our faith leaders as church health liaisons, as we've done in all of our past studies, where they're the ones who are actually implementing the study, the intervention in their churches, because there's no way that our team can go into churches and do this work and be in every single church, every single Sunday. And so they were charged with and trained to distribute the project tools. We wanted them to distribute at least 2 to 3 a month, to encourage their members to get tested for COVID-19, and to also encourage them to pre-register for the COVID-19 testing events. Each church did 2, one for their church members on Sundays during and after their Sunday morning service, and one during the week during their community outreach services. So while they were handing out food, because I don't know if you guys remember this, but you couldn't drive around the city in the middle of the week without seeing the lines of cars pulled up to churches, and they were putting food in their trunks and those kinds of things. And so we worked with them to figure out, okay, how can you tap into that, even that setting to provide COVID-19 testing? And then we trained them on how to coordinate their testing events with the Kansas City, Missouri Health Department, which has been one of our long-term partners. They actually did our HIV testing services in the churches for our Taking It to the Pew study. So we've been working with the Kansas City, Missouri Health Department for almost 20 years now. And they were delighted to be able to come out and do this testing. Why? Because they were being charged with getting testing done eventually in these underserved communities. So it kind of was a win-win for them as well. And then one of the key strategies that we knew worked in our past studies, and again, our Clergy Response Network, CAB told us as well, you have to have the pastor model the COVID-19 testing in front of their church members and during these outreach ministry programs, because if people can see their pastor getting this test, they'll be more likely to get it. Because do you guys remember when the testing first came out, how people were afraid of the testing, particularly in ethnic minority communities? I mean, you would hear things like, oh, they're going to use that syringe they're going to use that swab to put something in your brain to control you. Oh, they're going to use that to collect your DNA and then track criminals. And they're going to, you know what I mean? So there were all of these myths happening around COVID-19 that our Clergy Response Network was, and we were hearing them. I could hear them when I went to the local grocery store. And so having the pastor getting tested was really important. And then the ongoing technical assistance provided by our research team. So this is what our church-based COVID-19 testing events look like. We did have to really strongly encourage pre-registration. Do you think people pre-registered? No, they walked up. And we learned even more so from COVID-19, not just about the limited access to health services in person. We also learned about the limited access to technology, right? People not having access to the internet, or not being familiar or comfortable enough to go. I know even the first time that I signed up, it was a bunch of questions. And I think I got kicked out, especially for the vaccinations. I think I got kicked out like 2 or 3 times. You know what I mean? Because the system would overload. So imagine if you were a person where this is kind of a new experience and you haven't really used the internet in that way before. So we had mostly walk-ins or drive-ups, particularly during the height of the pandemic. And the testing took place, therefore, in parking lots, and then later on when people start going back into churches in the fellowship halls. And even that started on a limited basis because our churches still had to limit how many people came to church. So they were doing like, you know, if your family last name ends in A, C, E, you know, every other alphabet, you could come to church this Sunday and then the other half come the next Sunday. They were keeping a record of who were coming into their churches, following up on, you know, people who had were known to have COVID because they were doing their own kind of informal contact tracing within the churches. Especially since at the beginning of the pandemic, we had about 5 pastors die here in Kansas City who held church because they had heard the information, but they believed that God would protect them. I mean, this is literally some of the things we heard from these pastors, that God would protect us and our congregation from this from this disease. And, unfortunately, we know that wasn't the case. Uniquely, not only did the Kansas City Health Department come out to the churches to do the COVID-19 testing on Sunday, during church and after church services and during the midweek opportunities with the community outreach ministries, we also work with the health department to identify contact tracers that would be cross-trained as community health workers. Because one of the other things that our Clergy Response Network had told us was people are not going to pick up the phone. They're not going to talk to contact tracers. They're going to mistrust what they're going to use that information for. They're going to be afraid that they're going to call their employers and their jobs will be in jeopardy. I mean, they went through the whole litany of why people would be afraid of contact tracers. And they would know because they've done HIV contact tracing. So they kind of know, and we've had the health department involved in that work. So our Clergy Response Network, they kind of knew what the issues would be. So along with having them cross-trained as community health workers so that they could provide linkage to care services with those people who would test positive, we had them at the testing event. And the very first thing that people interacted with were the contact tracers. We wanted them to get to know who these people were so that just in case they tested positive, they would have met this person before. And not only that, we had a booklet that included the whole testing process and pictures and bios of our contact tracers. So that again, if one of these people called, they could look in that booklet to say, wait a second, are you at that? Who are you? You know what I mean? They could refer back to that information. And because the Clergy Response Network had told us that people were, remember in the early days of testing, that swab was so long, you would almost be choking. You know what I mean? It felt like it was scratching your brain or something. Yeah. I mean, our Clergy Response literally said, that swab that goes to the brain, they literally, would say that. You can't do that because people are not going to get tested. And so we used the PCR nasal test that only went in a half an hour. And they were able to get the results within 24 to 48 hours. Now, I know you can't read this from where you are, but I just wanted to show, we published this information too in the American Journal of Public Health, the importance of doing this work with our Clergy Response Network because church wasn't happening as church normally would. I mean, normally when we did studies in churches, we would go up to the podium, we tell people, well, in most churches, some men still don't want women on the podium, their podiums, which are precious only to men. But for the most part, we would go to the front of the church, we would tell people about the studies. We would be right there right after we told people about the studies in the fellowship hall to recruit people, tell them more about the study, recruit them, enroll them into the studies. But church wasn't meeting in that way during the pandemic. So our Clergy Response Network informed us of how churches were meeting in person. So things like a lot of our churches were having outdoor church services. They were doing that with the big screens and a little stage, and the pastor would preach, and it'd be like going to the drive-in. They were doing drive-through prayer services. So instead of people coming up to the altar, they'd be in their cars, and pastors and deacons would have on their gloves, and they'd anoint and pray for people through the car window. So they informed us of all of these different ways that churches were happening. And then even when they moved inside, about how they were being selective on making sure they maintained the low numbers in the pews, how they were using their small groups to gather people together instead of bringing them into the sanctuary. And we were able to use that to design this intervention, not only for the intervention components, but also for how we would collect data. And then they also shared with us on how they were using technology. And a lot of our churches had never used Zoom before. We had to teach them how to use Zoom. Many of them, this is when they started using text messaging with their members, really started trying to keep better track of their church membership list. And so they told us about how they were using Zoom and live streaming and social media in particular to get their messages out, and how they even reverted back to, do you guys remember the each one call one, the old telephone tree messaging? You'd have like two members would call two members, and those two members they even reverted back to that to get information out about not only what was happening in the churches in their own regular activities, but around COVID-19. So here's our research design for this project. First, we did a pilot study, which was so informative. Now, we got this grant we wrote the grant in August of 2020, and we got funded by December of 2020. So we were still in the height of things going on. And so we did a pilot study, and we learned so much about doing the testing through car windows. We learned a lot about sending out our survey links to church members, because for a lot of churches, COVID actually expanded their membership. Like they were having people in Africa, in Ireland, you know what I mean, tuning in to their services. And so our survey link was going out all over the world, and we were having to screen out people because we wanted to make sure that they could have an opportunity to be exposed to the intervention. But we learned a lot from the pilot study, and then we launched our clinical trial by March, of 2021. So imagine, everybody's just learning about COVID-19. We went from submitting a grant in August, being funded in December, and then launching a full clinical trial in March. So you want to talk about meeting the rapid acceleration of diagnostics goal, our milestones. We were able to do that because of the work that we had done with the Clergy Response Network. Our randomized controlled trial was planned with 16 churches. The goal was to recruit 960 participants in 2 waves of 8 churches, with churches being randomized either to our religiously tailored faithful response to COVID-19 intervention or a non-tailored standard intervention, because we were really interested in this cultural tailoring. Does it make a difference? Does it matter? And so because of that, even our comparison churches held 2 COVID-19 testing events as well as our intervention churches. It was a 4 to 6 month intervention. As I said, all 16 churches held 2 testing events, and we did baseline surveys and follow-up surveys. Our churches were all in the Kansas City, Missouri area and the social vulnerable communities that I described earlier. Wanted them to have about 150 church members who attended church at least once a month among our participants. We wanted them to have outreach ministries with community members who use those services at least about 4 times a year, because we wanted to make sure that they would have some contact with the intervention and that we could get back to them for a post-test survey. And then we wanted to make sure that they had a committed pastor and 2 to 3 church health liaisons that we would train. Again, I said we pay our churches well too. This is so important. So many times we researchers think, oh, well, churches are going to benefit from this study, so we don't need to pay them. No, they need to be paid because they're doing work. I mean, this is work. So we pay the pastor, we pay the church health liaisons, and then we have money that goes directly to the church, you know, to keep the lights on, to keep the heat going, that kind of thing as well. Yes.
How do you base that cost sheet off of? Are there like other studies, or did you just work with them?
We've kind of, over the last 20 years, we've kind of built it up. Oh, we started out paying churches $2,000. And we pay them $5,000. We didn't used to pay the pastors. And what we would find is that most of the pastors would do what they were prescribed to do. But then you'd have those handful that would just be like, we're just taking the money for the church and I'm not going to do, you know what I mean, what you told us to do. And invariably we would see, because we would observe these church services, the pastors would do what we have prescribed to do. People would line up to get tested when they wouldn't. So that moved us to paying the pastors as well. The 2 or 3 church health liaisons usually get split about $2,000 to $3,000. The pastor usually gets $1,000, and then there's another 1 to 2 that goes to the church.
So like investigators who want to do this kind of engagement, they should look at other studies, and when they design their study and budget, they need to think about this.
They need to think about that. And of course, we've vetted those numbers, not only how much we pay the churches, but how much we pay participants through our community action boards. Our surveys are very long, so we pay participants anywhere from $40 to $60 to complete our surveys. They usually take at least about, people who can read really well can get through them in about 20 to 25 minutes. Those who need assistance with reading, and there can be a lot, particularly among the community members that are in the outreach services programs, can be up to an hour to get through the survey. Yeah, but our cabs inform us of that, for sure. And so with the RADx Up program initiative, the primary outcome for everybody was COVID-19 tests. Can you get people tested? So we had that out as our objective data that we got from the Kansas City, Missouri Health Department, and we had the self-report data. But in this case, our faith leader said, you can go ahead and link objective data to the self-report data. So this is one of our first faith-based studies where we're actually able to link the two through a data share agreement that we have with Kansas City, Missouri Health Department. And for this study, if you guys are familiar with RADx Up, we had to use common data elements that were being used all across the country, which really lengthened this survey. But still, our faith-based leaders said, we need to know some other things. They wanted to know about grief. They wanted to know about mental health. So we added even more questions based on the input that they gave us to the survey. But again, because of the input that they gave us, we created electronic flyers that went up on their screens and went up on their membership sites with QR codes for people to get screened into the study. And then in person, our team they were in parking lots. They were along the street as cars would line up, handing people a tablet, an electronic tablet to complete screening and enrollment and consent and the survey through the car window. So stuff that we've never done before, but this is what the Clergy Response Network told us to do, and it worked. It worked so well that we were one of the few projects, in RADx Up, some of the projects were like statewide or region-wide projects where it was more like a demonstration project. Ours was a true clinical trial. And we were one of the few clinical trials that not only reached our recruitment goals, we exceeded them. Because of that, we recruited 981 people instead of the goal of 960. And then here you can see some of the demographics of our participants in the churches. Most of them, almost 90% were church members. Almost 50% attended church weekly. As I mentioned earlier, that's what we typically see. Average age was about 51. Almost 75% were females. It was actually a little bit higher than what we typically see as about 65% females. And when you go into churches, that's what you see, you know what I mean? So our participants were representative of, who was sitting in the pews. And then you can see there that a little over 50% either were on public health insurance or had no health insurance. So I just wanted to share some of our baseline data with you regarding barriers to testing and kind of overlay this with the things that our Clergy Response Network told us in advance that these are going to be issues. These are going to be issues that we're going to have to design the intervention around. And so in using our baseline data, we were able to look at how well did that align with some of the issues that the Clergy Response Network said, including they told us to introduce the contact tracers early because people would be afraid of them. See, over 53% of the folks at baseline said they would be afraid of contact tracing. They told us to normalize testing regularly to decrease apathy. You could see over 50% said, well, I don't want to get tested because I could get COVID later. I don't even have symptoms, so why should I get tested? They said it needed to be a comfortable testing method. Almost 50% said they wouldn't get tested if it wasn't comfortable, that they would experience some discomfort and so on. And then here's also some of the data on social determinants. 70% of our participants had more than one chronic health condition, which meant what? They were at incredibly high risk to have negative consequences if they were infected with COVID-19. About a third were food insecure, almost a third were essential workers. Almost 20% said they had transportation challenges, meaning that, even as that relates to health services, would they be able to get to a testing site? You know what I mean, if it wasn't in the church. And a little over 10% didn't have a home computer. So here's some of our findings from this study. As I mentioned earlier earlier, anybody could get tested. You did not have to be a study participant. And that's something else our Clergy Response Network said. We need testing in our community so desperately. These need to be opportunities for anyone to get tested. And RADXUP were totally cool with that because again, they wanted to increase testing in these underserved populations as well. And so across our 16 churches, we had 636 people get tested. You can see there the green bar is the intervention arm, the blue bar, bluish purple bar is our comparison arm. You can see that the intervention churches tested almost twice as many as in the comparison churches. Then we were able to link the testing data to our study participants. Out of our study participants, we see that 241 got tested. And of that 241, 160 were our intervention participants. So again, we saw 2 times the rate of our enrolled participants get tested in the intervention arm as compared to the control arm. Now, this is the data that I think is really interesting because that pattern of testing, this is what we've seen in a lot of our past church-based studies. And it usually is this 2-to-1 rate of testing, whether it's been HIV testing, dementia screening, mental health screening, diabetes screening in our past studies. You've seen about this 2-to-1 portion there. But this is what I find really interesting is, ultimately, who's exposed and how does that relate to whether or not they get tested? And so here you can see about 40% of our participants were exposed to contact tracers. About 45% were exposed to the pastor getting tested. About 60% were exposed to the different print materials that would be on resource tables that the ushers would hand out. And about almost 40% attended a testing event. And those were significantly related to whether or not people got tested. This fact of having these health professionals, these contact tracers being there on site, seeing their pastor get tested, having these materials available to them with factual information and information on resources, then having a testing event available. Now, granted, this could be what comes first, the chicken or the egg? You know what I mean? Is it because it was there or is it because they had intended to get tested? But still, it gives a view into some of those things that really could make a difference in these types of interventions, particularly as we develop our interventions so that they're multi-level. We try to tap into all of these different levels of the church outlet of contact, like their interpersonal contacts, the church services, and at the church community level. So with the church community level, having this accessibility to COVID-19 testing events could be really important. At the church services level, having a pastor modeling testing and the resource tables and the ushers handing out these materials. And then interpersonally, this interchange between contact tracers and the introductions at the testing events and the follow-up with the test results would be really, really important to consider. So here's some of our lessons learned with this project. Engaging our faith leaders and advisory boards and the design and procedure was really critical to us developing not only the intervention components, but the procedures in such a way that we could do them during the height of the pandemic and really address some of those challenges around feasibility. That churches being involved in these kind of projects can increase access to COVID-19 testing and contact tracing, particularly in non-traditional places and non-traditional times. I mean, and having it this way, people didn't have to take off from work to go get tested. They didn't have to figure out transportation in another way than what they would normally do to get to church to get tested. So these non-traditional places and times could really be important. Again, what the pastor says matters. Time and time again, we will witness this. People line up to get tested if the pastor says to do so, particularly if they incorporate some of the messages on why this is important in their sermon. That the church-based multi-level interventions can increase intervention exposure and give you more opportunities for people to get exposed to all of these different intervention components that are taking place and are being delivered. And that these existing church health academic partnerships are critical. I mean, it's the only way that we were able to hit the ground running was because we already had these long-term relationships. We already had these partnerships. And that can be really critical when responding to rapidly growing, epidemics, pandemics. like COVID-19 and addressing some of those barriers because, I mean, the scientists are already saying there's another pandemic right around the corner, and will we be prepared for it? Perfect timing. I won't do the other part of my presentation. I was gonna tell you about how we parlayed this into another grant from RADx Up, where we're looking at rapid COVID-19 testing. And then we're doing linkage to care using a telemedicine approach, where their COVID-19 test kit, when they scan it with the QR code, it brings up a telemedicine or telehealth proctor that walks them through the test. And if they test positive at the end, we'll then do the evaluation to see if they qualify for medication for treatment like Paxlovid. Then we'll prescribe the medication in that call. So we're doing that study now. We're wrapping that up this year under the RADx Up program. And then because of this work that we were doing, Jackson County approached us and gave us $10 million over 2 phases to expand COVID-19 vaccinations throughout Jackson County. And we're doing that work with not only churches, but with neighborhood associations, with youth organizations, with businesses, and applying this same model, but having each of those sectors tailor the work to their sector. So what's happening in businesses looks very different than what's happening in churches. And then because of all of this work, we won the National Association of American Medical Colleges, National Spencer Foreman Outstanding Community Engagement Award, which is a pretty big deal for medical schools in this country. So we're really proud of that. I won't tell you about our Healthy Jackson County project. I just kind of ran you through that, but ultimately, we provided COVID-19 vaccinations to over 20,000 people throughout urban Kansas City and some of the surrounding suburban areas in Jackson County, and have provided close to about 10,000 different health services from blood glucose, blood screening, blood glucose, blood pressure, mental health, HIV, STIs, dental assessments, and more by working with University Health and our 4 health professional school faculty and students going out to community clinics in those 4 sectors, in neighborhoods, in churches, in youth organizations, and at businesses. And so it's been an incredibly successful program. Just wanted to acknowledge all of these folks who've been involved. It takes a lot of people to pull off this kind of work. So as you can imagine, when we have research team meetings, we've got our community partners on the call, we've got our health agency partners on the call, we have our academic researchers on the call. And in that way, we're able to troubleshoot with everybody's voices again, and using that CBPR approach, being heard even on the research team, because we consider our community partners as our research team members as well. So I'll stop there and see if there's, whew, that was a lot. See what questions or comments you may have.
You started to address it at the end, where you talked about taking these principles and applying them to other groups. And I've just been thinking about how in the church, you've got the pastor who is the respected lead.
Right.
And talk a little bit more about other groups. Who would those experts or influential people be in other groups?
Right. No, that's a really good question. So that's what we had to learn when we moved to the Our Healthy Jackson County work. I'll just go back.
And I guess there's a follow-up question that might be able to take is, do you think it's equally influential in other groups? Or is there something special about the church?
So let me answer your first question. Before we wrote the grant for Jackson County, we did 50 meetings with community leaders across those 4 sectors, across our 4 health professional schools at University Health, Black Healthcare Coalition, KC Digital, to really understand how do we tailor this to these different sectors. Each sector came up with not only their own kind of toolkit of things, but also who those, we call them influencers, would be. And so for our neighborhood associations, our neighborhood presidents and neighborhood leaders have a lot of sway in our neighborhood, in our communities. And so they promoted their community clinics in the Our Healthy Jackson County project.
Is that in a Black community or?
Yes, in these same zip codes, in these same socially vulnerable zip codes, and we use a train the trainer approach. So they identified the key neighborhoods and the leaders in those neighborhoods, and we trained them. And then they trained the 2 to 3 people from their organizations as community health liaisons, and the churches, we call them church health liaisons. And in that way, we ultimately had almost 180 people trained across all of these neighborhoods, implementing the Our Healthy Jackson County initiative. They came up with different ways to disseminate the information. Now, we did have some standard tools that we used, but then, for instance, the business sector said, well, we want to use some of our money, because we gave them some, just like, this is money you can use to your discretion to tailor for your sector. So they did things like table tents, you know what I mean, on their counters. These were restaurants, businesses, those kinds of things. They put table tents on the sidewalks. They, neighborhood associations did door knockers. They utilized flyers like nobody's business. Churches did a lot of the stuff that, you know, we talked about here. The youth organizations identified their youth leaders and used social media like crazy, because the youth are tapped into social media. And so we're now looking at that data to look at what did that community mobilization look like across these different sectors, and trying to understand some of those things that you asked about. Another thing?
Oh, you had my question, yeah.
Same question?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so my question is kind of across all of your projects, I think. How do you balance like the feedback that you're getting from community members with, you know, the expectations of the rigor that's required in research?
Yeah.
And I think you gave a really great example of, we tested everybody because that's what they said that they wanted, not just the participants, but that grant funding allowed for that, right? So like, that's an example that comes to mind. Like, how do you balance that?
Yeah, so there's a lot of things happening behind the scenes, and I'll just use this as an example. For all of those materials that you saw back with taking it to the pews, I shouldn't say all of them, but for most of them, we've used a theoretical approach behind that. You know, Jessica stages a change in how people decide to engage in a new or, you know, recently or adjacent behavior. So that's tracking in the back of a lot of these materials. Like, how do you move people from pre-contemplation to, you know what I mean? So we talked a little bit about that with our CAP. Do they remember that? No, they don't. You know what I mean? Do they remember CVPR? They know that. You know what I mean? And then in having them in the CAB meetings design all of these tools, that's their major contribution, along with the procedures. Like, how do we actually do this? What's going to be feasible to do in churches? And we just, once we get that information and you standardize it, it's just like writing your standard, you know, procedures. We manualize it and we train, because again, our team we can't be in all churches every Sunday implementing this project. So we do first we do an interest meeting about the study, just to find out what churches are interested, and we feed them. We feed them well. You know, you're not supposed to feed people on NIH money, so we feed people with have other money. We feed them, we take them to Jack Stack, we take them to PF Chang's or wherever they want to go. And we tell them about the study, and we collect information about the churches and see if they meet our criteria to participate in those interest meetings. And then we have like half-day workshops. And we have found, this is really a good note, people can't take in more than 4 hours of information that's new to them. You can put people in an all-day workshop training session and you've just wasted your time. Because you will bring them back and they will act like you're talking Greek. You know what I mean? So 4 hours is about the most that we will train them in initially. And we bring all of the intervention churches, the church health liaisons and pastors together and train them together, because that way they can ask questions that somebody else may not think about. They can learn together. They know who each other are, and we don't mind that. We don't consider that to be cross-contamination across that particular arm. Then we do the same with the comparison arm. With the comparison arm, once we're done, we give them all the same training and materials that the intervention arm received and make all the contacts and how to coordinate their events with the health department. And then we do a follow-up training individually with each church. And we do 2 of those. Because that's when they're really like, okay, now I get it. And they have their materials in hand and they've been using them and, you know, that kind of thing. So we really try hard to maintain some of that rigor and fidelity through those trainings and through our observations in churches. The other thing that we do is our church leaders give us monthly their implementation data. You know, what tools are they using? How are they using it? With what groups are being exposed to it? And that's a way for us to not only learn what's going on, but to kind of fine tune, like, are they sticking close to the cloth and what we train them on as well. So we try to maintain rigor in that way as well. And then, of course, you know, with our surveys, we follow in our IRB applications to the team. So, but even with that, the feedback from our community and telling us, how can you come into I mean, in some churches, they want you to do the survey in the sanctuary. Some of them, you got to do it in the fellowship hall. In this case, we were doing surveys in parking lots. And so we really try to listen to what they say, and then we build that into our IRB applications. Yep. Well, thank you so much for sitting in on this session. I hope it was something that you learned today. And I'm always available. I'm at UMKC, so if you ever have any questions about this kind of work, feel free to reach out. We're always connecting people with future partners, and anybody is welcome to our CAB. And that's the beautiful thing about our CAB. Anyone can show up at that CAB meeting as well.